fact that there's some semblance of continuity, some semblance of consolidation of the membership, their activities, I think is something that strikes outsiders like ourselves in Europe who are not part of the process. I think it's quite interesting that over the years, the membership seems to have worked out a process of collaboration and productive engagement from meeting to meeting. What I think has interested me and impressed me the most is the fact that below the summit meeting, which is the thing that's the most visible to the outside world, there are ministerial meetings, there are meetings of specialists and experts on a wide variety of subjects. And reading the declaration of the heads of state, which is quite lengthy, seems to indicate that there's a full agenda of work. Something which I think many of us in Europe are probably not conscious of, but we're beginning to realize that this system, this BRICS process, is becoming one of the world's emerging institutions. I think that's its core raison d'être. I mean, when it was established 10 years ago, I think that was one of the main motivations. The fact that these countries that were emerging economies weren't allowed or didn't seem to be able to play a full role in the international economic governance system as established by the other powers, the other traditional established powers after World War II. So they were looking to try to generate a kind of dynamism or a dynamic between themselves to represent at least part of the emerging world. So it's not surprising, as I say, that's their core activity, occupation, objective. The rest of the world, whether it ranges from the established institutions like the EU to the IMF, the UN, if they haven't already, need to pay more attention to this new process, this new entity, which is speaking out, which is establishing positions, representing their interests naturally, perhaps the interests of other emerging markets and economies, and perhaps giving them a greater voice, greater attention in the other institutions of global governance. I mean, that's the IMF, that's the EU, that's the G20. There are a lot of other connections between the rest of the world and the BRICS process. Yeah, well, there's a common interest, I think. I think none of the other BRICS partners had rejected the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The EU, the rest of the international community doesn't seem to have rejected it. There's only one major power that seems to have turned its back on it. So I think it is worthwhile that other institutions speak out and are ready to engage on this process. I think even within the other major power, the US, that's rejected the Paris Agreement. There are individual states that are very important that want to continue to also observe it. So I think it builds up a momentum that in a way isolates the government in Washington. And I think that's all to the good. There are other areas which the BRICS meeting voiced its interest in, its support of. That's an open and equitable trade system, which again is called into question, certainly in Washington and in other, some other economies. But I think it's good to maintain a solid bloc. And in this case, it's not only China, but it's India, it's Russia, the BRICS members, it's the European Union, and many other countries that are solid in these issues: climate change, open trade, and so on. As I say, they're taking on what seems to be a full agenda of work or ambitions, objectives, and that's, well, that reflects the fact that they think they are becoming mature enough to undertake these ambitions. Now, of course, every institution, the EU included, the UN, is judged on its deliveries. The fact you can establish a calendar, an agenda of ambitions, but how much you deliver is the important thing. And I think it's important not only for the visibility of the institutions or the international governance system, but for the populations of these countries. I think they're the ones that are going to be, in a way, as demanding as the rest of the world, to show some concrete, tangible outputs. A good meeting is one that doesn't show any obvious tensions or problems between the member countries. And just before the meeting, there were tensions. There were, in fact, serious geopolitical border tensions between India and China that they seem to have wanted to resolve before that meeting. And I think that that indicates a desire, a willingness by these two members and all other members to resolve the underlying differences, tensions that are natural probably between any country, any two countries, any three countries, to get them out of the way to achieve a greater result of cooperation together. I think there were, I think that showed a willingness to try to resolve these issues if they weren't created artificially, to artificially resolve before the meeting. Anyway, I think it was a good signal that it was symbolic of a certain trust between the two countries, that after some difficulties they could get together and agree on a lot of issues. Some of the BRICS countries weren't convinced of before they went into the meeting. So there had to be a kind of dynamic of cooperation within the meeting itself, too. Yes, there was a segment in the final declaration on peace and security, and a considerable emphasis on terrorism. Some of them focused on specific areas of terrorism, Syria or parts of Central Asia. But it's interesting because that's another example. I had been told before the meeting that at least one of the countries wasn't convinced that that was one of the areas that BRICS should involve itself in. Geopolitical issues were discussed in other forums. So they were not convinced. But again, inside the meeting, there apparently was some discussion and sufficient agreement to come up with a consensus view on some of these subjects. There are other subjects that to me were a bit surprising and welcome. That's one of the other areas that I've been interested in because unfortunately, the 5 BRICS members have serious corruption problems. It's a universal problem. We have it in Europe. It exists in all parts of the world. It's a human characteristic. But I think 2 of their presidents, the BRICS presidents, have been legally charged with corruption. Another one has a public image problem. In China, there is a strong anti-corruption process going on that's been going on for the past 2 years. So I was very much interested how they would address that issue. They addressed it, which may or may not be sufficient. They entered into specifics. Cooperation with the Financial Action Task Force on money laundering, which is a serious problem for them, for the rest of the world, linked to organized crime, to internal corruption, to terrorism. If they can really generate some concrete cooperation, I think that will be very important and make their views known in some of these other global institutions. I think it's one of the areas that will bear close attention. It's not a new issue. I was even picking up several years ago, 10 more years ago, from individuals, colleagues, students, party members, that corruption was a major issue in China, a major problem. And it started under the previous Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao administration, and it was picked up even more forcefully by President Xi Jinping, and it's become a constant preoccupation. I think we still don't know the results, whether it inspires confidence. I think it looks like a never-ending challenge. Some of it is internal, some of it is, again, in this aspect of money laundering, exporting hot money to other countries. I think it's a global problem, and a country like China has to address it for its own internal well-being and stability. Economic development is strongly related to corruption. I mean, the more corruption there is in a country, the less development there is. In China, there seems to have been a steady path of development, but X percentage of the GDP was probably going under the table, so it's wasted energy, money, except for a few individuals. Anyway, I've been interested in this issue for quite some time, and I think it still seems to be a solid, ongoing process in China. There have been some apparent counter demonstrations and doubts about the leadership and how far it will go. But I think people in China and the rest of the world are watching what happens.